Senator Chambers would move to amend Senator Flood's amendment. Senator Chambers would move to amend with Floor Amendment 83.
Senator Chambers, you are recognized to open on your amendment.
Thank you. Mr. President, members of the legislature, if you will look on your gadget, it tells you to turn to page 1 or begin by looking on page 1 of the amendment. My proposed change will address existing language. As I state over and over, when a bill comes before us, and as I read through what is being proposed, if I find language which I think can be clarified, either by deleting something, adding something, or explaining something, I will do that. So this is going into existing language. On line 22, strike the word for, F-O-R, and insert to meet the reasonable needs of. This language is related to the finding of the legislature. And this part that I'm talking about refers to when certain actions have to be taken because there is insufficient water to go around. The current language says when the groundwater supply is insufficient for all users. I would add language to say when the groundwater supply is insufficient to meet the reasonable needs of all users. It could be argued that it's clear, should be clear to any reasonable person that you're not referring in this existing language to any use that a person wants to make of this water. Well, since it jumped out at me that we can tighten down what it is we're talking about, the language that I'm offering will do that. The bill itself, LB 701, is making what I consider a radical departure from the way things currently are being done. We're trying to tie up loose ends. We're putting new concepts into the law which were not there formerly. Money is going to have to be coughed up by people who were not coughing up money before and did not want to have to cough up any. So while these big things are being done, Senator Carlson, the small things ought not be overlooked either. I will tell you another beneficial purpose of what it is that I'm doing. Committee amendments, the ENR amendments, deal with a number of substantive issues. If there are members interested in what we are doing, those members will have 3 opportunities to speak on the entire list of ENR amendments, and maybe time would run out. By my offering these types of amendments, not only is the language improved, in my opinion, but it gives opportunities to go into the more substantive aspects of the ENR amendments. My amendments don't require a lot of time to explain, nor do I think they will require a lot of discussion to be understood. But if there are other aspects of the ENR amendments which do need discussion, not necessarily because people are opposed, but for verification and to build a record, that can be done while the amendments that I'm offering are being discussed. Nobody will have to make a motion to bracket, to indefinitely postpone, to strike things from the amendments which they really don't want to strike but are only trying to create an opportunity to speak. So, Senator Carlson, in addition to sometimes being that iron bar that is forced between the teeth of the gears of the machinery that will bring everything to a halt, more often, but it's not noticed, I can provide the oil that will lubricate the machinery and facilitate its smooth and efficient operation. If you have, though, any questions about the amendment I'm offering, I'm prepared to answer them. And since I just got the E&R amendments, I'm going to have to kind of go through them and see what is here, and I may have some questions about those issues. But as for now, the amendment that I've offered, I think, is clear. So that's all I have to say at this point, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Chambers. Senator Flood.
Mr. President, I am nonplussed. I don't often offer amendments which have no significant comment one way or the other, but I suppose it could either be to how meritorious the amendment is, or people may just be tired this morning. If somebody had offered the amendment that I'm offering, I would not have much to say about it either, because really it is right on the money and it should be adopted. So I will let that conclude my remarks on this particular amendment, Mr. President, and attempt to pull myself together. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Chambers.
Mr. President, members of the legislature, when we are looking at the thrust of this bill, including the existing language, you will see on page 1, in line 17 and line 18, this terminology, a reasonable and beneficial use. That is good phraseology, reasonable as well as beneficial. So if you turn to page 2, in lines 2 and 5, lines 2 and 6, we have the word beneficial. So what I want to do in line 2 on page 2 is insert the words reasonable and preceding the word beneficial, and in line 5, after the word the, insert reasonable and beneficial. Then we have the terminology consistent with the reasonable and beneficial use terminology on the preceding page. So all this amendment would do is, in the 2 places on page 2 that I detected, we will not just have the term beneficial use standing alone. I will insert reasonable and, so that that language will read reasonable and beneficial use, and it will parallel or mirror that language found on the preceding page. That's what the amendment does. And I think that I may be the only one really interested in maybe additional discussion, so I didn't have all my minor amendments drafted, but that is what this one would do. And in order to try to trigger some interest and concern on the part of my colleagues, you need to be wary when a person of my ilk will approach you and say, these are very reasonable amendments. That is the perfect strategy to persuade people to lower their guard and accept what's being said. I believe this is a good amendment, but there are other things that I felt and believed deeply were good amendments which were not adopted. I had my teeth kicked in yesterday as a result of my very meritorious attempt to lower the sales tax from 5.5% to 5%. Now that was a very good amendment of considerable consequence. And even though I presented a lengthy discussion and argument to persuade you of that point, I did not persuade enough of you. Now here I come with something that is dealing with a very important piece of legislation, And you're just going to let me stand on this floor and say, I'm asking you to do this, and you just look at me and say, okay. Well, I guess maybe so. I've had time to craft another amendment in the meantime, Mr. President, so that's all I will say by way of opening on this one. Thank you.
Direct a couple of questions to Senator Chambers.
Senator Chambers, will you yield to a couple of questions?
Yes.
Senator Chambers, to simplify things here, would you define reasonable?
Yes. Senator Carlson, that is a state of mind that would be the state of mind of a person who, in possession of all the facts necessary to reach a decision that accords with those facts, would then make a decision based on those facts that would take into consideration those facts, recognize them, and act in accord with them.
Okay, thank you. Would you define beneficial?
Beneficial is that which is helpful, I think that's good.
Is it very important that things be both reasonable and beneficial in all cases?
I think with what we're talking about, it is necessary because it would be beneficial for a person to perhaps use what is considered an excessive amount of water for irrigation purposes. But when you look at what we're doing in terms of allocating water in an equitable, which means fair and just manner, it would not be reasonable to let this one person gain this tremendous benefit or profitableness from doing that which is unfair to everybody else. So when we're talking about the usage of water, it should not only be beneficial, but it also should be reasonable.
If you were to prioritize reasonable and beneficial, which is most important?
Well, if I can determine which came first, the chicken or the egg, I might be able to do that. Some things we discuss because of the limitations of language sequentially. One is mentioned before the other, or is apparently given a priority over the other. So I think you would look at the specific facts of the particular situation and then make that determination.
Thank you, Senator Chambers. Once again, I've proven you're as good on your feet as I thought you were.
Legislature, my seatmate, who has absented herself temporarily, looked over to me today and said, you got nothing. Today we will see if you get all. I couldn't resist sharing that. And that also, I'll do some improvement, and as I go through the next three, I think that might be all I have. It won't be to construct the other amendments that I have. But while on my feet, I'll explain why it took me a little time. The copy of the amendment, the E&R amendments, which was given to me yesterday, is somewhat different from the one that we have today. So to be sure that the amendments I wanted to craft would plug into the page and line numbers in the E&R amendment that we adopted today, I had to compare that which I had yesterday with what I was given today, so that despite the fact that the wording of my amendments will be the same, they may not have fit with today's version of the amendment as they did with yesterday's. That's all I have, Mr. President, and I will accept you all's vote, and we will hold the applause until the final amendment has been offered and adopted without a dissenting vote. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Chambers. Members of the legislature, you have...
Thank you. Mr. President, members of the legislature, this that I'm doing goes into existing language once again. And there may be another place in existing language where this is found, and if so, the speaker is going to check and see. But if you will turn to page 2 in line 13, we're talking about certain things being done in order to achieve locally determined groundwater management objectives. Well, I've been discussing this bill with Mr. Cookson, or is it Crookson? I've had plays on his name in my mind, and that's not what I want to do today, so I want to get it right. It's Mr. Cookson. But I was going to make some kind of comment based on what people told me about why people of that party are called Republicans, or the river's called Republican after them, because it's so crooked. Well, I was going to say because he is dealing with the river issue, his name is appropriate, which is Crookson, but it's not Crookson, it's Cookson. So I wanted to be sure that I got his name correct, so I looked at the card that he gave me. And I want Mr. Cookson to know, because wherever he is, he's listening. This amendment is not for the purpose of giving or making a play on his name, but to point out that he and I have been discussing this bill. Any answers that I needed to any questions, he assured me he would be forthcoming with such answers. His work that he has performed on this bill and in other areas than just working on this bill, but dealing with water matters, his work has been very good, highly competent, and I want to make that clear. But we were discussing this amendment that I told him that I'm going to make. He reminded me that when we adopted LB 962, we expanded this concept so that it didn't apply just to NRDs, but to basins, regional areas. So instead of having just the word locally, I will insert the word and the two words and regionally. I want to be sure that I got it correct. While my time is running, I think the clerk may want to speak to me, so let the time run on, and I'm going to see what this is, Mr. President, in case I need to elaborate further. President, that's just the kind of guy that I am. And I appreciate you doing what you did, because it gave me the opportunity to speak to the clerk and get clarification on what Senator Flood was trying to bring to my attention. I have the exact same version of this amendment up there twice. In trying to be sure that I had something on the desk, I had drafted the amendment to yesterday's ENR version, and when it came up, I would have corrected it if the reference to page and line number had been incorrect. But fortunately, this aspect of the two versions of the ENR amendments are the same. So that's what the Speaker was asking me when he asked, were there two locations or something to that effect. So we will deal with this amendment only one time. If you have been very circumspect and had manipulated your gadget to see the nature of all the amendments that I've offered, you would have seen two versions of the same one. So this is the only version that I will offer. And if you need me to elaborate further on why I'm giving it, I will do so. But in case some missed it when I gave the explanation earlier, the language in the existing law talks about achieving locally determined groundwater management, but now there is a regional component too. So I would add the words "and regionally." So the language would read in line 13, achieve locally and regionally determined groundwater management objectives. Thank you, Mr. President.
I think by putting regionally in there that we could hinder that language for other NRDs across the state.
No. Senator Loudon, do you like lemon pie?
Pardon?
Do you like lemon pie?
If it's got meringue on it.
You read my mind. I was going to tell you, this is the meringue on top of the lemon pie. What we're dealing with here in the existing language is legislative intent language, and it's talking in this part that I'm amending. The legislature recognizes the need to provide for orderly management systems in areas where management of groundwater is necessary to achieve locally, and I added regionally determined groundwater management objectives. With what we're doing in this bill, we're talking about basin-wide problems. So when we are talking about management of groundwater, we're making it clear that we're not restricting our focus to what might affect an NRD, or as you say, a sub-district, but the entire basin, if that should be necessary to have an effective water management plan.
Okay. Now, my next question is, because I'm well versed in this, I chased cows all my life and you chased words, but should we have and or regionally determined? Should we have an or in there, an and or?
Senator Loudon, do you like lemon pie or cherry pie?
No, I'd rather have lemon.
Okay. In some situations, we can say either or when it doesn't matter which you take, or you might have one but not the other. In this case, we should use the conjunction and because we're talking about both. You might have a management plan that applies only to what an NRD is doing, but it should be clear that what we're looking at, even in that context, is a basin-wide management plan. In the same way that water, while it's liquid, well, water's always liquid, but it cannot be divided by drawing a line across it. These management plans should be seamless, and nothing should be done in one area that is going to hinder or disrupt what would affect the well-being of the entire region. So this amendment is not going to hurt anything that is going on now. It simply says that what is envisioned by the existing language is expanded to include the basin area and not just what an NRD is doing.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Chambers.
Mr. President, members of the legislature, I will explain this amendment. It's on page 3. In line 5, I would strike the word compensate and substitute in its place the two words provide compensation. What this word compensate is referring to is a financial payoff, in a manner of speaking. The language in the provision that my amendment goes to speaks of economic assistance, the purchase of water, and so forth. This is intent language, and as pointed out by the speaker when he addressed it, the purpose is to make it clear that what we're doing in this instance is not to set a precedent of the kind which would justify somebody in relying on what we did in this bill as a basis for saying this is what you must do as a legislature anytime a similar problem may arise. So the meaning of the word compensate, as you find it in the language in the ENR amendments, refers to money given in exchange for water rights or whatever it is that is perhaps going to be purchased, or to give compensation to ameliorate, to mitigate, to overcome any economic impact resulting from necessary regulation. There may come a day when regulation will be essential and it will produce a negative economic impact. This bill is not designed to suggest that whenever a regulation results in a negative economic impact, that the legislature is going to cough up some money. We know that under existing laws relative to eminent domain, the state cannot take private property for a public purpose without giving fair compensation. That is not what is being dealt with in LB 701. This language, without my amendment even, is designed to make it clear that we are not establishing a precedent or stating how these matters will be handled in the future, when it comes to somebody alleging that he or she has suffered an economic loss. Since what we're talking about is money, it would be better to say compensation rather than to have the word compensate. The word compensate could refer to more than just money. It could mean you're going to make something better. If something bad happens, you're going to do something to make up for that may have nothing to do with money. Let's say that you have a grove of olive trees in Nebraska, and because it's necessary to regulate water, and Senator Carlson got us a bill that's going to deal with removal of certain types of vegetation. Somebody could say, well, if I'm going to have to get rid of these trees, then you have to compensate for that, meaning replace the trees with other trees. And that is not going to be done, because if the purpose is to remove the vegetation, period, then you cannot insist that that particular vegetation be replaced by other vegetation. That might be a poor example, but it's to let you know that the word compensate could refer to something other than financial. This area that we're dealing with here relates to financial compensation to try to make a person whole or to overcome whatever negative economic impact could result from necessary regulation. And you'll notice in the existing language, in line 6, they're talking about regulation that is necessary. Had I constructed that language, I would have put the word necessary in front of regulation. But since I don't want to let my obsessive compulsive nature just run away with me, but I'm having a strong urge here. Is this Senator Loudon's bill? Oh, let me ask Senator Langemeier a question.
Senator Langemeier, will you yield to a question?
Yes.
Senator Langemeier, could you turn to page 3 of the committee amendments?
Yep.
In line 6, would it bother you if I would move the word necessary so that it precedes regulation instead of having it follow regulation, so that it says, the current language says, resulting from regulation necessary pursuant to, I would say resulting from necessary regulation pursuant to. Or don't you see any difference?
I guess I would have to be sold on your justification.
I'll leave it alone.
To the importance.
I'll leave it alone. It's not really important probably to anybody other than me. Because to show you the way I feel, and that's all I'll ask you, Senator Langemeier, thank you. I think ain't is a word that ought to be given the dignity and status of acceptable usage. Ain't could be a word that can be used to express the singular or the plural. I ain't, he ain't, they ain't. Now I have to say, if speaking of myself, I am not. He is not. They are not. But ain't is like a utility word. It fits every situation, and English is a language that's supposed to be alive and growing. Just because something seemed appropriate ages ago doesn't mean it can never change. You all would understand high-tech changes. If you can make these gadgets on our desk work a lot faster, you would do that, because you want to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible. And for those who might know, I got a long way to go and a short time to get there. We're going to do what they say can't be done. You've heard that? That comes from Smokey and the Bandit. And they had to get a load of liquor from one point in one state to another point in another state. And Smokey was the cop. Burt Reynolds was the bandit. He was going to drive this souped-up sports car in front of this semi full of liquor, and he would be the decoy, and Smokey would chase the decoy, and that would let the semi go where it's going. But that's another definition for jet propulsion. Long way to go, short time to get there equals jet propulsion. If we would use the word ain't in language, we're doing the same thing. Remember, I ain't, you ain't, he, she, it ain't, they ain't. Fits everything. So why is it rejected? Why? So, I ain't going to tell you that I ain't going to use ain't as we proceed during the session, but if I do, you'll know why. And that's all I would have to say on this amendment. Are there any other lights on, Mr. President?
By making that change, do we infer that that which is not money that might have been gleaned from this originally is now is precedent, I guess? Here's the way I would answer that, Senator Fulton. That is. That is not, is not. That is not that is, and that is not that is not. And that ain't Smokey and the Bandit. I guess right. if we change this, would the record indicate that we are inferring that means beyond monetary compensation, which would compensate for something?
No, I think from the discussion it's clear that the purpose of this language is to show that the compensation that we're giving now under this bill of a financial nature is not the precedent, that we're not going to give financial compensation whenever it's necessary in order to regulate, to do something that may result in a negative impact on somebody. And I think the question was very legitimate, and I think our exchange might make the record crystal clear as to what is meant.
Good enough. Thank you, Senator Chambers. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Fulton and Senator Chambers. Senator Chambers, there ain't any other senators wishing to speak. You are recognized to close on FA 87.
Thank you, Mr. President. And in view of the fact that Senator Flood ain't over there and his seatmate ain't over there, he's lucky his seatmate ain't over there, because if his seatmate had seen Smokey and the Bandit and knew who Junior was, I don't think Senator Flood would be standing in full health right here today. And anybody who has not seen that movie, you ought to see it the next time it comes on. In closing, I would just like to do something which I would want to do because I had seen it done when people get an Oscar. I cannot act well enough to be cast in a movie. And if I were cast in a movie, it would not have the quality that would result in an Oscar being given. But what I hate more than anything else, but would like to do to punish people for having the Oscar ceremony. Thank everybody I could think of, and those I couldn't. So in view of the fact that many have worked on this bill, here's what I would like to do. I'd like to thank the following senators: Adams, Aguilar, Ashford, Avery, Burling, Carlson, Chambers, Christensen, Cornett, Dirks, Dubas, Engel, Erdman, Fisher, Flood, Friend, Fulton, Gay, Hanson, Harms, Heidemann, Howard, Hudkins, Jansen, Johnson, Karpachek, Copeland, Cruz, Langemeyer, Lathrop, Loudon, McDonald, McGill, Mines, Nankis, Nelson, Pauls, Pankinen, Peterson, Persh, Preister, Rakes, Rogert, Shimmick, Stuthman, Sinowicki, Snicky, Wallman, White, and Whiteman. I'm thanking those who were directly involved. I'm thanking those who were indirectly involved. And I'm thanking those who simply stayed out of the way. And Mr. President, thank you.